The simple lessons from looking at the history of progress are that so progress is not automatic. Even when the scientific underpinnings for an invention, for instance, are known and in place, the invention doesn't happen automatically. Even when an invention has been created, the business that distributes that invention doesn't happen automatically, isn't created automatically. Every step is a new step that needs to be taken and moved forward by people with work and effort and time, blood, sweat, and tears. And also every step entails risk. The fact that the scientific underpinning for, the fact that that electricity, the physics of electricity has been discovered, does not mean that it's obvious that the electric telegraph can be created, or that the electric motor can be invented, or that it would work, or that electrical light bulbs are going to be practical, et cetera. All of those things entail risk and entail solving new challenges. And again, once you've invented the electric motor, it's not obvious that there's going to be a market for it, and it's not obvious what the right business model is, and so forth. So at every step, there's work to be done, and there's uncertainties and risk. And because of that, every step requires funding, requires material resources to, if nothing else, to pay for the time and the living of the people who are doing the work, and also often to pay for materials, to pay for capital investment, and so forth. So progress requires funding. It doesn't happen automatically. And then I think the other thing that we can, so one simple, obvious lesson of that is the value of surplus. The more surplus we create in the economy of any kind, the more we've got extra resources sitting around to invest in the future, to invest in progress and innovation. The other thing that I think you see from the history of progress is that even when surplus exists, it is not automatically allocated to the most promising and productive uses, especially in hindsight. So a simple story around this is the story of penicillin. Penicillin was one of the first really powerful antibiotics, not the very first, but really it was a game changer in medicine. And penicillin was the action of penicillin as a microbiological discovery, a scientific discovery, occurred in 1928 with Alexander Fleming's discovery in a petri dish that a certain type of mold was repelling or was killing bacteria. The first clinical trials of penicillin were not performed until 1941, over a decade later. And a lot of that is because the penicillin discovery essentially sat on the shelf for about a decade, in between Fleming's discovery and his initial attempts to try to do something with it. And then several years later, it was it had been sort of put on the shelf, pretty much literally. Fleming had samples of the mold around that he was willing to give out to anybody who wanted to experiment with it, for which he deserves eternal credit for simply doing that. Right. But he didn't know what to do with it. The fact is that simply discovering the mold doesn't get you the drug. Penicillin as a drug, by the way, it's not a mold. It's not as if you just inject the mold into people's veins or feed it to them. That doesn't work. The penicillin, the drug, is a chemical excreted by the mold. And what you need to do is extract that chemical and purify it. And doing so is a chemical engineering process which needed to be invented. And Fleming was not the one to do that. He wasn't a chemist. He was a microbiologist. And it turns out that penicillin as a chemical is actually quite difficult to work with. It's easy to break down. It easily decomposes. And so it was Howard Flores Lab in Oxford that actually did the work to figure out the chemical process to extract penicillin, and then ran the clinical trials and proved that it worked. And then it was actually a lot of US government labs during World War II that took this process and scaled it up to industrial levels to do more trials, and ultimately to turn it into a drug that can be used first for the military, because it's during World War II, and then expanding it to the general population. And even, by the way, Howard Flores Lab, when they picked up this project, again, about a decade after Fleming's original experiment, Howard Flores Lab was dramatically underfunded. They were scraping together donations of a few £100s here and there in 1940s money to just keep the lights on, keep the heat running, literally. They were cribbing supplies from the cafeteria, like metal trays. They had so little penicillin that they were working with that they were literally collecting urine from the patients and extracting the penicillin from the urine to recycle it. because it would just go through the body. That was what they needed to do because it was so difficult to make at the time. They had a hard time getting factories in Britain to manufacture it because all the factories were busy with war work, right? Not that, by the way, penicillin ultimately would be seen as very valuable war work, but it wasn't obvious at the time because it was just still in the experimental stage and all the factories needed to make things that were more obviously needed for the war effort. So it was really the surplus capacity of the United States that was extremely helpful there. So all of this just shows that, if you had a crystal ball in 1940 or even 1928, and you could sort of predict which technologies that had not yet been fully developed were going to change the world, your alarm bells would be going off at level 9 or 10 for penicillin, right?
Right.
You would have been screaming at the whole world, no, focus on this, fund this, get the money over here. Let's just get this thing done.
Yes.
But nobody knew that at the time. And arguably they could not have known it even with the best, even with the best of intentions and processes. And so I just think all of this says funding for progress is extremely important. And funding mechanisms are extremely important. And so it would make a lot of sense for us to examine the ones that we have and ask whether we have the right ones and the right portfolio of dollars, allocated to all these different mechanisms. If you even just look at U.S. funding today for research, government funding for research, you have approaches as diverse as, say, the NIH and DARPA. Whereas on the one hand, NIH funds things largely through a sort of peer review-driven process, a committee of your peers who review proposals, score them, average the scores, debate in committee, and so forth, to, on the other end of the spectrum, which has certain virtues and advantages, although on the other hand, you can also imagine a lot of ability for consensus and groupthink to creep in and perhaps drive out contrarian sort of maverick, wacky, high risk, high reward ideas. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like DARPA, which takes a program manager who'll come on for a tour of duty, 3 to 5 years, and have pretty much sole control over a sizable budget to contract out for, again, high risk, high reward ideas that are, and DARPA explicitly kind of sees their role and their goal as funding things that nobody else is going to fund, make things happen that wouldn't otherwise have happened or that would have taken much, much longer to happen. And literally they see their role as changing people's minds about what's possible.
Okay.
And so it's just a very different, and I'm not even saying necessarily that one of these is better or worse than the other. Maybe we need both. Maybe we need a portfolio of allocation to them. But I think these different models are to harken back to the article in The Atlantic from Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison that kicked off the whole progress studies movement. These models are understudied, right? And there's sort of not enough attention paid to them and not enough people asking and answering the question of, do we have the right set of funding models and mechanisms? And do we have the right portfolio allocation of dollars? Why does NIH have a budget of 41 billion and DARPA, have a budget of maybe what, 3 or 4 billion, and the NSF have 7.5 billion? And somebody just proposed, by the way, that we should ramp up the funding of NSF and give it an extra $100 billion over the next 5 years, ramping its budget up to almost the level of NIH, and that is at the same time NSF should take on more responsibility for technology rather than sort of quote unquote pure basic research. Is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? I think we should have a sort of robust literature of understanding and studying these effects to even be able to begin to address those questions.
All right. Wow. And that's a big area of your interest. One categorization you could make would be nonprofit versus profit models, like a very broad one. Just try to bring it down here a bit. What are, I guess, some of the pros and cons of various nonprofit and profit models? Maybe is a good general question. You seem to be I just wind you up and you go off. So
yeah, that's right. Well, I actually wrote a whole essay about this recently, about different types of funding models and about, in general, sort of pros and cons of nonprofit and for-profit models. I see some very deep advantages to for-profit models. In fact, I put out this sort of bold thesis that essentially anything that can be for-profit should be. That doesn't mean everything can be. I think there are a lot of things that really can't be done very well with for-profit models, and so there's plenty of room for nonprofit. But the beauty about for-profit models, where they're possible and make sense, is the way that they keep you honest and align incentives. When you I identified in that essay 2 basic feedback loops that do this. One of them is the simple feedback loop that if you are charging money for a product or service, then you essentially need to prove in reality that your product or service is valuable to people at a certain level of value, and that it's valuable to a large enough market, and you prove that through your revenue, right? People are willing to buy your product and service. They're not forced to, presumably. They have options, hopefully, if you're not in maybe if you haven't been granted a monopoly by some government agency, and so now you've actually got to prove your worth out there in the marketplace. But the other feedback loop is in what projects even get investment to be created in the first place, and this is a feedback loop where investors put in money and ultimately they get money back as a return. And so again, you've got to prove. Investors have to prove over time that they know how to allocate resources by actually showing over time that they're getting a return from those resources. If they, the more that they correctly allocate, or the more good bets they make, the more resources they get to continue investing with, and the more they lose, the more they don't have any resources to throw around anymore. So those 2 feedback loops, I think, are extremely important, and they have a few other sort of ramifications that might not be super obvious. So one of the great benefits of charging for your services is that your operations can scale with your market size. Essentially, they can scale with demand because the revenue for the operations is coming directly from the demand. If you are sort of in a pure charity model, right, the problem with pure charity models is that you cannot necessarily scale your operations to provide what you provide to everybody who wants or needs it, because the money's not coming from them; it's coming from some third party who is just not directly connected. Again, not to say that charity shouldn't exist. Obviously, it exists exactly to fill in those holes where that can't happen. But if you have 2 models of being able to provide a value, and one of them is self-sustaining and self-scaling because you're charging directly for your services, and the other is not because it depends on charity, I submit that the self-sustaining and self-scaling version has that very strong advantage. And then the other thing I sort of point out is that actually 2 other things. One thing is that the ability to quantify value at all parts of these feedback loops allows you to bring in an entire toolbox of metrics and mathematical analysis and optimization. And in fact, we have an entire discipline and profession around this. It's called accounting. And so financial metrics really let you optimize things for effectiveness and efficiency in a way that I think nothing else does. And just to sort of move on quickly, the last thing that I think is really underappreciated is on the investing side, that investing feedback loop.
Yeah.
For-profit investing aligns incentives in that it encourages high-risk, high-reward bets, and it encourages sort of contrarian bets. So it encourages investors to seek out investment theses that no one else believes in, and to invest in things that no one else wants to invest in. And this is sort of the opposite of how nonprofit funding generally works. People are much more kind of consensus seeking in the nonprofit world. Because they're not seeking a financial return. They're seeking acclaim. They're seeking prestige. They're seeking approval of others. Not always, but very often. And so if you think about risk profile, the risk profile of new experiments is generally strongly asymmetric upside, limited downside. You try an experiment, usually the worst thing that happens is you just waste all of the resources that you put into that experiment. You just lose all the money. You lose 1x the money that you put in. But the upside of an experiment can be hundreds or thousands of times return on the resources that went into it. And this is true whether it's a business and the returns are directly returns to the founders and the investors, or whether it's a science experiment and the returns are not captured directly but accrue to society at large. So you've got this huge upside, limited downside. Unfortunately, and when you are a for-profit investor, again, it's pretty much the same way. The worst that happens is you lose all your money. The best is you can make, 1,000x return. Unfortunately, with nonprofit funding, I'm afraid that the risk profile is inverted. If the best thing that can happen is you get some prestige. But if you backed the thing that had 1,000x return to society, you don't really get 1,000x the prestige. You don't get 1,000x the acclaim or the lauding of society. And in particular, you don't get 1,000x for being right early, for being the backer who backed the thing when nobody else believed in it. Nobody else really remembers that you were the one who believed when it seemed to everybody else to be like a crazy idea. And therefore, everybody wants to glom onto things after they're already successful, which is exactly when they don't need, the resources nearly as badly. But on the downside, I'm afraid we have more asymmetric downside risk, because if you do back the crazy thing and it doesn't work out, I think it's much more common for that to be, to just kind of ruin your reputation or your career, which will look really bad or really stupid. And we've fixed that in investing just through culture. Nobody in investing really cares about your flops. Nobody cares if you made a bet. Certainly if it was a small bet, like an early seed stage investment on something that turned out to be stupid or crazy or just flopped or blew up. But in the nonprofit world, I think there's much more of a worry that if you back something that looks stupid or crazy, it could be even a career-ending move. And so we've got the risk profile just absolutely backwards in nonprofit. And I think we've got to find a way to flip those incentives to make it more like for-profit investing, so that you've got limited downside and asymmetric upside, which corresponds with the actual outcome and benefits of these experiments.
Wow.